And for me, like all these things go together. I mean, maybe without this excessively dangerous, threatening crisis situation, we wouldn't be at a certain point forced to access these latent and dormant powers of the mind. So for me, it's like we've actually almost willed ourselves into this crisis situation, so that we're forced to step up to that next level of consciousness. But I also discuss in the book, like visiting the Hopi Indians and talking to them about their prophecies and finding the elder and all that stuff, but also reading this Cambridge anthropologist who worked with them for years. And he was a total materialist, Cambridge schooled. And in his book, he's like, look, Peter Whiteley is his name, perfectly enough. Peter Whiteley says, look, I hate to admit this, but but sometimes I would go to these Hopi rain dances, and it would be 120 degrees, burning sun, clear blue sky. They would dance for 20 minutes, clouds would gather, and rain would fall. And he also talked about sometimes he would go to the Hopi elders with a whole list of questions, and they would just answer the questions before he asked them, like one after another. It was like they just knew exactly what he was going to say. But I think that first aspect, I mean, I just ask you to entertain the possibility. I mean, that's one thing that really throughout the book, it's a thought experiment. It's a kind of a hypothesis in a way, and then me trying to use my own intellect and experience to sort of test the hypothesis in various respects. But the hypothesis is that if human consciousness somehow intensified through ritual, through psychic work, through ceremony, has the capacity to affect the climate. How interesting that would be as we go into this extreme climate perturbation, and all of the stuff that Gore talks about, inconvenient truth and so on. I mean, what if what is going to be compelled out of us is really like almost like a collectivized work of human consciousness around the planet to correct the problems in climate. So that's some of the stuff I was exploring in the book. I mean, so one main theme was really this idea that like I guess like my whole project has been like I started out with the first book saying like, well, what the hell is going on here, And for me, this shamanism provided an answer that I accessed to me what seemed like these legitimate other forms of consciousness and even other realities. I mean, in that book, I talk about ayahuasca, and one of the chemical components of ayahuasca is DMT, or dimethyltryptamine. And DMT is a chemical that's produced in the brain by the pineal gland. There was a Dr. Rick Strausman who was given the first federal approval to do like work with psychedelics since the 60s. He ended up writing a book about his experiments called DMT, the Spirit Molecule. And Strausman had basically was a Buddhist, and he'd read in Buddhist texts that according to Buddhism, the soul reincarnates 7 weeks after death. And in his studies of biology, he learned that the pineal gland appears in the brain during fetal development exactly 49 days after conception. So he thought that was a pretty interesting synchronicity. And especially interesting because the pineal gland has been considered to be the kind of singular seat of the soul by Descartes. And it actually is a kind of evolutionary third eye. It apparently has like a lens and a cornea. And it produces different chemicals. So he thought that if this was the case, then what happened in the pineal gland might be how a chemical produced by the pineal gland could be kind of a conductive element that would bring the reincarnating soul into the body, and then at birth or before birth, and then release it at death. So he began to look for candidates, and first he did studies on melatonin. And, it was interesting, but nothing much happened. So then he studied DMT. He began to give people DMT in laboratory settings. And he found that people would have these very, very completely intensive out-of-body experiences, the sense of entering this other totally alien dimension. And I've tried DMT twice. I mean, even though it's in your brain and spinal column and produced by many plants, it's an illegal Schedule I substance in most of the world. But if you smoke DMT, you have this experience of almost being shot out of your body, like being shot from a cannon, into a kind of other dimensional reality, which is almost feels more authentic than this one. And there's a sense of there being like sort of consciousness present there, like beings who are perhaps sort of far beyond where we are in terms of their consciousness evolution. And you get this little like 5-minute time period or 5 to 7 minute time period in this other reality, and then you get kind of shot back into your body here, and you have to try to like make sense of the whole experience. So there you have it, DMT. So experiences like that, these other substances for me were like gave me some indication that I hadn't gotten the whole story from the secular materialist background that I'd grown up in, and that a lot more might be going on in the cosmos, and also kind of opened me to a sense that I think one of the things that they discovered in the 60s that psychedelics are kind of like very powerful as a social deconditioning agents. They kind of allow you to sort of step back and look at all the components of your world and see how they're not natural processes, but kind of social contracts and social products. So, we've defined architecture in a certain sense, in a certain way. Money is a social contract. It's something that we've given energy and power to. It doesn't exist naturally. And even the way we've constructed time is a kind of social construct. As sort of hard as that is immediately to imagine, I mean, we basically, there's a whole part in the new book where I look at this philosopher, Gene Gebser, and his whole focus is on different ways of looking at time. And he talks about the evolution of consciousness being related to different realizations of time and space, and that there's been a number of sort of consciousness structures. He's German, so he likes to use like consciousness structures and words like that. But that we sort of, these structures are formed around these different realizations of time and space, and then at a certain point there's a kind of crisis of anxiety, and then a mutational break into a new structure, a new realization of time and space. And since the Greeks, we've been in a certain construct of time and space. Basically, since the Greeks, the Renaissance through today, we became kind of obsessed, fascinated, almost possessed by materiality, by spatial reality. So we began to think of everything in terms of spatial reality. And among those things, we think of time as a quantity, as a kind of spatialized material quantity. So our whole way of thinking about time is we talk about having enough time, running out of time, wasting time, spending time. We're constantly conceiving of time as this thing that you can somehow get your sort of conceptual hands around, that you can have enough of it or not enough of it. And Gebser points out that has absolutely nothing to do with the reality of time, that it's just a construct that we've created. It's a conceptual way we have of being in time. The title of his book is The Ever-Present Origin, which for him it describes the way the Aboriginals are in time. So for the Aboriginals, there's never a fall into a degraded state. Aboriginal literally means of the origin. So the idea is that they sort of maintain themselves in this perpetual origin place, and their rituals are about sort of maintaining the proper order of the universe and the cosmos. And then there's this kind of magical time, kind of tribal magical cultures, where there's kind of magic is about instantaneous manifestation, telepathy, synchronicity. And then there's the kind of mythological cultures, which is like Egypt, the Mayans, the Hindu culture, where time is seen as cyclical. So time is kind of like this vast cycle that repeats in different ways. So you have Egypt has the precession of the equinoxes, which is a 26,000-year cycle. The Hindus have the yugas. We're now in the Kali Yuga, which is the last age of the cycle. So Gebser's argument is that in the previous times we've kind of gone from one of these to the next, kind of X'd out the previous form of time. But he suggests that this next shift we're going into is actually one where we kind of recognize that all of these forms of time are simultaneously occurring. So right at this moment, we are in the origin time, and this is the first moment of existence ever, and we're sharing this moment together. We're also in this telepathic, instantaneous magic time, and we're in this cyclical, mythical time. We're in the transition between the age of Pisces and the age of Aquarius, according to the Egyptian model. We're in the end of the Kali Yuga, according to the Hindus, and we're in the approaching the end of this great cycle of the Maya. And we're in a linear time, conceptualized linear spatial time that's defined by the Gregorian calendar or could be defined by another timekeeping device. So he says that it's when we look at when we sort of integrate all these different ways of being in time, it would be this next level of consciousness. And I think it's a very interesting conception. So I mean, and then the other idea that if you think about our calendar now, the Gregorian calendar, basically around 5,100 years ago, which was the beginning of this great cycle of the Mayans, we went from tribal sort of matrifocal cultures that worship the moon and the moon goddess to masculine, patriarchal, hierarchical kind of priest cultures that worshipped solar masculine deity. And one of the first things those cultures did was that they created a new calendar where they went off the lunar calendar and created a calendar where they abstracted the year into roughly 12 equal parts, left with like 5 days that were considered highly unlucky days. And the whole, the reason 13 is unlucky is because 13 is the number of moons in a year. So 13 was actually the sort of number associated with natural, harmonic, and feminine, intuitive patterns. And we kind of demonized it and suppressed it because we went into this kind of masculine, solar, rational consciousness and rational logic. If you look at our Gregorian calendar, we have a calendar that has the months are these arbitrary constructs that have no connection to lunar cycles. It's just, there's no reason that 1 month is 29 days and 30 days in conjunction with what's happening to the planets. And Jose Arguelles, who's one of the big kind of visionary scholars in terms of this Mayan material, he points out that it might actually be, we don't think of a calendar as being important, but you could conceive of a calendar as kind of like a meta-programming device for consciousness. And that it's on this very subliminal level, it's like either attuning you to natural harmonic patterns that are connected to how the universe works and the planets move, or it's desynchronizing you from those patterns. So he argues that if you have a calendar that's desynchronized from natural patterns, everybody who's part of that culture begins to go crazy because they're just alienated, and they have less and less connection to anything natural. So in a way, you could say that we work. I mean, if you look at our history over the last thousands of years, but in hundreds of years, it's almost like we alienated ourselves from nature and the feminine and the sort of great mother and the goddess to construct this kind of masculine rationality, strong individuality. And I'm not putting that down. That absolutely is a necessary part of the process. It's a necessary aspect of this whole evolutionary process. But as we go into this massive crisis where our desynchronized relationship to nature and our kind of dominator mentality to the natural world is now coming back to haunt us, we have to find a way to kind of reharmonize with natural patterns. And one kind of instrument for doing that, if you're kind of thinking about how to help a global shift in consciousness to happen, might be a new kind of calendar that was accurately synchronized to planetary cycles. So, and if you notice, whenever there's a major revolution, whether it's the French Revolution or the Russian Revolution, one of the first things they do kind of automatically is create a new calendar. They create like a year 0 or a year 1. And I don't think we're going to have a kind of volatile revolution in that respect, but there might be a kind of supersession of the present order that we're in. Because, as John was talking about with me earlier, I mean, if you look at what a lot of the sort of scientists, economists, theorists are saying from many, many respects, we're in a kind of a suicide paradigm at this point. And we're going to need like a restructuring of our global society and a kind of new reordering of the situation. And so one instrument to kind of key people into that, or to allow them to absorb a new pattern, could actually be a new calendar. So one thing I ended up proposing in 2012 is that at some point we could actually have a global meeting of minds, like a kind of forum where we would think about time. You'd have physicists, people from different spiritual traditions, astronomers, and create a different kind of template that could be kind of more universal. I mean, it's very amusing to me that I ended up having such big thoughts because it didn't seem like that was my life, where my life was headed. I mean, I was a journalist and I was trying to write fiction and so on, but I've just been running with this program and just seeing where it goes. So I guess I could take some questions.